The carriage wheel snapped just outside the gates of Ashcombe Hall, and Eleanor Whitfield was thrown forward into the mud, with nothing left to her name but a letter, a torn traveling dress, and 3 days until her family lost their home forever. She did not cry. She had promised herself, back in the small cottage where her mother waited with fear in her eyes, that she would not cry until the matter was settled one way or another. She picked herself up from the wet gravel, brushed the dirt from her sleeves, and looked up at the great stone house rising before her like a judgment. Ashcombe Hall was larger than she remembered from her childhood, when her father used to speak of the Ashcombe family with a mixture of respect and quiet bitterness. Back then, the two families had been close, bound by old friendships and older debts. Now only the debts remained, and they had grown into a monster that threatened to swallow everything Eleanor had left. Her father had died 6 months earlier, leaving behind papers, promises, and a debt so large that the local solicitor had gone pale reading the numbers aloud. The only hope, the only thin thread Eleanor could still hold on to, was an old arrangement her father had made years before with the previous Lord Ashcombe, a promise that in hard times, the families would help each other. Eleanor had come to collect on that promise, though she doubted anyone at Ashcombe Hall even remembered it existed. She walked up the long drive on foot, her trunk left behind with the wrecked carriage, her boots sinking into mud with every step. By the time she reached the servants' entrance at the side of the house, rain had begun to fall in earnest, plastering her hair to her face and soaking through what remained of her dignity. A young footman opened the door before she could knock, took one look at her drenched and travel-worn appearance, and pulled her inside without a single question. "You're late," he said, not unkindly, but with the brisk efficiency of a man who had too much to do and too little time. "Lord Ashcombe was expecting the new girl an hour ago. Come, no time to waste. Mrs. Whitmore has been asking after you all afternoon." Eleanor opened her mouth to explain, to say that there had been some mistake, that she was not the new girl he was expecting, that she had come to speak with Lord Ashcombe about a matter of great importance. But the footman was already moving, pulling her by the sleeve down a narrow corridor lit by a single lamp, and the words caught in her throat. She told herself she would explain everything once they reached whoever was in charge. There would be a moment, surely, when someone would ask her name properly, and she would say it clearly, and the confusion would end. But the footman moved quickly, muttering about how the house was short-staffed and how Lord Ashcombe did not tolerate lateness, and Eleanor found herself swept along a current she had not chosen to enter. They stopped before a heavy oak door. The footman knocked twice, then pushed it open without waiting for an answer. Inside, a man stood with his back to them, looking out a tall window at the rain-soaked gardens below. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes that spoke of quiet wealth rather than showy fashion, and even from behind, there was something commanding in the set of his shoulders. "The new girl has arrived, my lord," the footman said, and then, with a small bow, he was gone, leaving Eleanor alone in the doorway with a stranger who had not yet turned to look at her. "You are late," the man said, still facing the window. His voice was low and even, but there was an edge to it, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I do not tolerate lateness in this household. Do you understand me?" Eleanor's cheeks burned. She opened her mouth to correct him, to say that she was not a servant at all, that she was Eleanor Whitfield, daughter of the late Edmund Whitfield, and that she had come on a matter that concerned them both. But before she could speak, the man turned. His eyes were sharp and gray, and for one heartbeat something flickered across his face, a question, a hesitation, as though he sensed she did not quite match his expectations. Eleanor felt her breath catch. Then the moment passed, and his expression hardened back into cold authority. "You will address me as Lord Ashcombe, and you will follow the instructions given to you without complaint," he said. "My grandmother arrives within the week, and this house must be in perfect order before then. I have neither the time nor the patience for excuses." "My lord," Eleanor began, but he was already crossing the room to a small writing desk, pulling open a drawer, and retrieving a folded gray dress and a sheet of paper covered in neat slanted handwriting. "Your uniform," he said, placing the dress into her arms before she could refuse it. "And your duties for the week. You will report to Mrs. Whitmore, who will show you where you sleep and where you work. I expect the East Wing bedrooms aired and cleaned by tomorrow evening, the silver polished before Sunday, and the garden paths cleared of the storm debris by week's end. Is that understood?" Eleanor stood frozen, the rough gray fabric heavy in her arms, the list of chores pressing against her fingers like an accusation. This was the moment. This was when she should have said his name, should have told him plainly who she was and why she had come. She had rehearsed the words on the long journey from her mother's cottage, had practiced them until they felt smooth and confident in her mind. But looking at him now, at the coldness in his eyes and the impatience in the set of his jaw, she understood with sudden and painful clarity that this man had no interest in old family promises. He saw her as nothing more than hired help, arrived late and dripping on his fine floors, and if she told him the truth now, in this moment, with mud still drying on her hem and rain still tangled in her hair, he would see only a beggar's daughter come to ask for charity. She thought of her mother, waiting at home with the last of their savings spent on the journey here. She thought of the 3 days remaining before the debt collectors arrived to take the only home she had ever known, and she thought, with a strange and sudden clarity, that perhaps there was another way. If she stayed, even for a short while, disguised as nothing more than a servant girl, she might learn something useful. She might find the right moment, the right words, the right way to reach this man and remind him of what his family once owed hers. A cold introduction in a rain-soaked doorway would win her nothing, but time, even a little of it, might win her everything. "Yes, my lord," she said quietly, and the words felt strange and heavy on her tongue. "I understand." Something in his gaze lingered on her a moment longer than necessary, as though he noted the careful way she spoke, the straightness of her back despite her exhaustion, the manner of a girl who did not belong in a servant's dress. But whatever question formed behind his eyes, he did not voice it. "Good," he said simply, and turned back to the window, dismissing her as easily as one might dismiss a passing thought. Eleanor left the room with the gray dress clutched to her chest, and the list of chores trembling slightly in her hand. In the corridor outside, she allowed herself one long, unsteady breath, the first she had taken since the carriage wheel had broken and thrown her into the mud. She found Mrs. Whitmore in the servants' hall, a stern woman with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. The housekeeper looked her over from head to foot, taking in the ruined dress and the exhausted face, and clicked her tongue. "You look like you've been dragged through a hedge backward," Mrs. Whitmore said, though not unkindly. "Well, no matter. Get yourself changed and I'll show you where you sleep. What's your name, girl?" Eleanor hesitated for only a moment. "Ellen," she said, choosing the small lie carefully, shortening her own name into something plainer, something that would not draw attention. "Ellen Whitfield." "Ellen, then. Follow me, and quickly. There's no time to stand about admiring the furniture in this house." As Eleanor followed the housekeeper up a narrow servant's staircase, she caught one last glimpse through a window of the study she had just left, where Lord Julian Ashcombe stood still at the glass, watching the rain fall over his family's land, unaware that the servant girl he had just dismissed held the power to unravel everything he thought he knew about his father's debts, his family's honor, and the promises made long before either of them had been born. The staircase was steep and narrow, nothing like the grand marble steps she had glimpsed through the front windows on her way in. This was a different world entirely, hidden behind the walls of Ashcombe Hall, a world of hard floors and long hours that Eleanor had never been meant to inhabit. Yet here she was, climbing toward it willingly, a servant's dress folded over her arm and a stranger's name already settling uneasily on her tongue. At the top of the stairs, Mrs. Whitmore pushed open a plain wooden door to reveal a small room with 2 narrow beds, a washstand, and a single window overlooking the kitchen garden. Another girl was already there, folding linens by candlelight, and she looked up with open curiosity as Eleanor entered. "This is Alice," Mrs. Whitmore said. "She'll show you the ropes. Mind you're both up before dawn. Lord Ashcombe does not care for a slow morning, and neither do I." The housekeeper left them, her footsteps fading down the stairs, and Alice set down her folding to study Eleanor more closely. "You don't look like the other girls who come through here," Alice said, not unkindly, tilting her head. "Your hands are too soft, and you stand too straight. Where did you come from?" Eleanor's heart beat faster, but she forced her voice to stay calm and even. "Does it matter? I need the work, same as anyone." Alice studied her a moment longer, then shrugged and returned to her linens, apparently deciding it was none of her business. "Suit yourself. Just be careful around Lord Ashcombe. He's not cruel, not really, but he's got no patience for lies or laziness. Caught the last girl stealing from the pantry and had her gone within the hour." Eleanor swallowed hard and changed into the gray servant's dress in the dim candlelight, folding her own ruined traveling clothes into a small bundle and tucking them beneath her narrow bed. As she lay down that night, exhausted beyond measure, she stared at the low ceiling above her and thought of the letter still hidden in the lining of her old dress, the letter that named her true identity and the debt that bound the Ashcombe and Whitfield families together. Tomorrow, she told herself, she would begin her work. She would scrub floors and polish silver and air out bedrooms for a grandmother she had never met, all while searching for the right moment to reveal who she truly was. It would not be easy, and it would not be safe, but it was the only path left open to her, and Eleanor Whitfield had never been a woman to turn away from the only path available. Outside, the storm continued to rage against the windows of Ashcombe Hall, and somewhere below, in a study lit by a single lamp, Julian Ashcombe remained standing at the glass long after the new servant girl had gone, troubled by a feeling he could not quite name, a sense that something important had just walked through his door, and he had been too blind, too tired, and too certain of his own judgment to see it. Eleanor's hands were bleeding by the second day, small cuts along her knuckles from scrubbing stone floors, with water so cold it numbed her fingers within minutes. She had never known work like this, the kind that started before the sun rose and did not end until long after it set, the kind that left her back aching, and her thoughts too tired to form complete sentences by the time she finally lay down each night. Yet she did not complain, not once, not even when Mrs. Whitmore scolded her for moving too slowly on her first morning, not even when a heavy bucket of water splashed across her apron and she had to work the rest of the day in a damp dress. She had a purpose here, a reason to endure it all, and she held on to that reason the way a drowning woman holds on to driftwood. The East Wing bedrooms took her the better part of 2 days to air and clean properly, each room grander than anything she had seen since her own family's fortunes had collapsed. She dusted shelves lined with books she recognized from her father's own collection, the same editions, the same authors, a strange and painful reminder of a life that had once run parallel to the Ashcombe family before falling so far behind it. Alice worked beside her most days, chattering easily about the other servants, about Mrs. Whitmore's strict rules, about Lord Ashcombe's temper, which she insisted was worse in appearance than in truth. "He's not cruel," Alice said one afternoon as they polished silver together in the servants' hall, breathing warm air onto spoons before rubbing them bright. "He's just carrying too much. His father left this whole estate in a terrible state, debts everywhere, half the tenant farms behind on repairs. Lord Ashcombe has spent every day since his father passed trying to fix it, and I think it has made him forget how to be gentle." Eleanor kept her eyes on the spoon in her hands, careful not to let her face betray anything. "What kind of debts?" she asked, trying to sound as though the question meant nothing more than idle curiosity. Alice shrugged. "All sorts. Old promises made by his father to families who fell on hard times. Some of it was generous, some of it was foolish, according to Mrs. Whitmore. Lord Ashcombe has been trying to sort out which debts the estate can still honor and which ones nearly ruined it in the first place." Eleanor's stomach tightened. She thought of the letter hidden beneath her narrow bed, the promise made between her father and the previous Lord Ashcombe, and wondered with a growing unease whether that same promise had been one of the foolish ones Alice spoke of so carelessly, one Julian Ashcombe might already be planning to set aside. She saw him only rarely during those first days, always from a distance, striding across the grounds with tenants in tow or shut away in his study with stacks of papers rising around him like fortress walls. But on the third evening, as she carried a tray of tea to the small drawing room where he sometimes worked past dark, she found herself face to face with him for the first time since her arrival. He looked up from his papers, and for a moment, something like recognition crossed his features, though Eleanor could not tell what exactly he recognized. Perhaps only her face, remembered vaguely from the rainy doorway on her first night. "You're the new girl," he said. "Ellen, is it?" "Yes, my lord." She set the tray down carefully, her hands steady despite the sudden pounding of her heart. He studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes narrowing slightly, as though trying to place something out of order. "You move differently than the other girls," he said finally, straighter. "And your speech is careful, more careful than I would expect from someone in your position. Where were you employed before this?" The question hung in the air between them, sharp and dangerous. Eleanor forced herself to hold his gaze, to keep her voice light and unbothered. "In a household not far from here, my lord. My previous employer valued careful speech among the staff. I suppose the habit remained with me." It was not entirely a lie, she told herself. Her previous household had simply been her father's own house, and the careful speech had come from a governess rather than an employer's demand. But Julian Ashcombe did not need to know the difference, and for now her answer seemed to satisfy him, though his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than necessary, before he returned his attention to his papers. "See that the fire is kept lit in here through the evening," he said, his tone returning to its usual brisk authority. "I have accounts to finish before my grandmother arrives." Eleanor curtsied, the motion still unfamiliar and awkward, and left the room with her heart hammering against her ribs. She had come so close to revealing herself in that small exchange, closer than she had intended, and she understood now that Julian Ashcombe was not a foolish man easily deceived. He was watchful, sharp, and already beginning to notice the small inconsistencies in her disguise. She would need to be more careful. Over the following days, their paths crossed more often than Eleanor expected, small moments woven into the rhythm of the household. She caught him watching her once across the length of the dining hall as she helped set the table for a meal he would take alone, his expression unreadable, his gaze lingering just a moment too long before he turned away. Another time, she found him standing in the library as she dusted the shelves, and though he said nothing, she felt the weight of his attention on her the entire time she worked. It was during one of these encounters, on a quiet afternoon when rain once again threatened outside the tall windows, that Eleanor overheard a conversation that changed the shape of everything she believed about the man who employed her. She had been sent to deliver a message to the study, only to find the door slightly ajar and Julian's voice carrying through the gap, sharp with frustration as he spoke to his estate manager. "I will not abandon every promise my father made, simply because it would be easier to do so," Julian was saying, his voice tight with restrained anger. Yes, some of his arrangements were foolish, made in moments of misplaced generosity, but others were made in good faith to families who trusted him. "I will not become a man who breaks his word simply because it has become inconvenient to keep it." The estate manager murmured something Eleanor could not quite hear, and Julian's voice rose again, firm and unyielding. "The Whitfield promise stands until I have reviewed the full account of it myself. I owe the family that much, whatever their current circumstances. My father gave his word, and I will not dishonor his memory by treating that word as worthless simply because gold has grown scarce." Eleanor stood frozen in the corridor outside the door, her breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat. He knew the name. He knew of the promise. And more than that, he had spoken of honoring it, of refusing to abandon it despite whatever pressure he faced to do otherwise. The cold, dismissive man who had handed her a servant's dress on her first night suddenly seemed like only half of the truth, a mask worn over something more complicated underneath. She retreated quietly before either man could notice her presence, her mind spinning with this new understanding. If Julian Ashcombe intended to honor the Whitfield promise, then perhaps her deception had been unnecessary from the start, a desperate mistake born of fear rather than careful thought. And yet, some instinct held her back from revealing herself immediately. She thought of Alice's warning about his temper, about how he despised lies and would not tolerate laziness or deceit among his staff. If she confessed now, admitting that she had lived under a false name in his household for days, would he see her deception as understandable desperation, or would he see it as a betrayal that erased whatever goodwill his father's promise might have earned her? The uncertainty gnawed at her through the following days, even as her work continued and the household prepared feverishly for the arrival of the Dowager Lady Ashcombe. Every surface in the house was polished, every garden path cleared of storm debris, every bedroom aired and dressed in fresh linens, until Ashcombe Hall gleamed with the kind of readiness reserved for royalty. Eleanor found herself growing curious about the grandmother whose arrival had thrown the entire household into such careful preparation. Alice spoke of her with a mixture of fondness and wariness, describing a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, who had run the estate herself for many years before passing its management to her son and, eventually, to Julian. "She sees everything," Alice said one evening as they prepared the grandest guest room for the Dowager's arrival. "Nothing gets past Lady Ashcombe. Mrs. Whitmore says she can spot a lie from across a crowded room, and I believe it. You'd do well to keep your head down when she arrives, whoever you are." The words settled uneasily in Eleanor's chest. She thought of the letter still hidden beneath her narrow bed, of her father's careful handwriting naming the old friendship between the Whitfield and Ashcombe families, a friendship that had apparently included the woman soon to arrive at this very house. If anyone in this household might recognize her true identity, it would be the Dowager herself, a woman who had perhaps known Eleanor's mother in the years before circumstance had separated their families so completely. 2 mornings before the Dowager's arrival, Mrs. Whitmore called Eleanor into her small office off the servants' hall, a room lined with ledgers and account books that recorded every detail of the household's operation. The housekeeper's sharp eyes studied a paper in her hands, and Eleanor felt a cold dread settle over her before a single word had been spoken. "I wrote to your previous employer for a reference, as I do with every new girl who comes through this house," Mrs. Whitmore said, not looking up. "Strange thing. No household by that name seems to exist in the parish you mentioned. Care to explain that, Ellen?" Eleanor's mind raced, her pulse loud in her own ears. She had known this moment might come, had feared it every night since her arrival. Yet she had not prepared a proper answer, too consumed by the daily exhaustion of her work to think clearly about the lies still standing between her and discovery. "There must be some confusion in the address, ma'am," Eleanor said carefully, keeping her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. "My previous employer moved households not long before I left their service. Perhaps your letter was sent to the old address." Mrs. Whitmore's eyes lifted from the paper, studying Eleanor with the same sharp attention she gave to a poorly cleaned silver spoon or a crooked row of stitching. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, and Eleanor forced herself to meet the housekeeper's gaze without flinching, though every instinct urged her to look away. "Well," Mrs. Whitmore said finally, setting the paper aside with a small sigh, "your work has been satisfactory enough these past days, whatever the truth of your history. I have no time to chase down addresses with the dowager arriving so soon. But mind yourself, girl. I do not tolerate deceit under this roof, and neither does Lord Ashcombe. If I learn you have lied to me, you will regret it." "Yes, ma'am," Eleanor said, relief flooding through her so suddenly that she felt almost dizzy with it. "Thank you, ma'am." She left the housekeeper's office with her heart still pounding, aware that the warning had cut far closer to the truth than Mrs. Whitmore realized. The encounter left her shaken for the remainder of the day, her hands unsteady as she worked, her thoughts circling endlessly around the growing danger of her situation. Every day she remained at Ashcombe Hall under a false name increased the risk of discovery, and increased too, the weight of guilt settling in her chest each time Julian Ashcombe spoke to her with something like trust in his voice. On the evening before the dowager's arrival, Eleanor found herself alone in the kitchen garden, gathering the last of the evening herbs by lantern light, when she heard footsteps approaching along the garden path. She turned, expecting Alice or one of the other kitchen staff, and instead found Julian Ashcombe standing a short distance away, his coat collar turned up against the cool evening air. "You work late," he said, his voice quieter than she had heard it before, stripped of its usual brisk authority. "There is always work to be done before an important arrival, my lord," Eleanor replied carefully, setting down her basket of herbs. He studied her for a long moment in the dim lantern light, and something in his expression softened, just slightly, into something closer to curiosity than suspicion. "My grandmother arrives tomorrow," he said. "She was very close with a family whose fortunes have fallen badly in recent years. I intend to make things right with them, if I am able, though I confess I do not yet know how to begin." Eleanor's heart pounded painfully against her ribs. "That is a kind intention, my lord. Perhaps," he said, his gaze drifting toward the darkening sky, "or perhaps it is simply the only decent thing left for me to do, given how badly circumstances have already treated them." He looked back at her then, his gray eyes catching the lantern light. "You have a way of listening, Ellen, that makes a man forget he is speaking to a servant rather than a friend. I hope you do not think me strange for saying so." Eleanor's throat tightened with something she could not quite name. Guilt and hope tangled together in equal measure. "Not strange at all, my lord," she managed to say, though her voice trembled slightly on the words. He nodded, seeming almost embarrassed by his own honesty, and turned to walk back toward the house, leaving Eleanor alone in the garden with her basket of herbs and a heart that had grown far too complicated for the disguise she still wore. Tomorrow, the dowager would arrive, and with her, perhaps, the unraveling of every careful lie Eleanor had told since the night her carriage wheel broke outside the gates of Ashcombe Hall. The dowager's carriage arrived at exactly noon, and within moments of stepping through the grand front doors of Ashcombe Hall, Lady Margaret Ashcombe had already reduced 2 footmen to nervous silence, and sent Mrs. Whitmore scurrying to correct a crooked portrait in the entrance hall. Eleanor watched from a distance, positioned near the staircase with a stack of fresh linens in her arms, as the elderly woman moved through the entrance hall with a cane she seemed to use more for emphasis than support. She was small in stature but commanded the room entirely, her silver hair pinned severely beneath a traveling bonnet, her dark eyes sweeping over every detail of the household with the sharp precision of a woman who missed nothing. Julian greeted his grandmother with genuine warmth, a side of him Eleanor had not yet witnessed, bending to kiss her weathered cheek and offering his arm as she stepped further into the hall. For a moment, the cold and burdened lord of the manor disappeared entirely, replaced by a grandson who clearly adored the formidable woman before him. "You've grown thin, Julian," Lady Ashcombe said without preamble, her voice carrying easily across the hall. "I trust you have not been neglecting your meals in favor of those endless ledgers." "I have been managing, grandmother," Julian replied, a faint smile touching his usually stern features. "Managing is not living," she said sharply, though affection colored her tone. "Now, introduce me to your household." I intend to know every face under this roof before I retire tonight." It was as the dowager moved through the assembled staff, offering brief and pointed comments to each servant in turn, that her sharp gaze finally landed on Eleanor, standing near the back with her armful of linens. Something shifted in the old woman's expression, a flicker of surprise quickly masked, as her eyes traveled over Eleanor's face with an intensity that made her stomach twist with dread. "And who is this?" Lady Ashcombe asked, her cane tapping once against the marble floor as she took a step closer. "The new girl, my lady," Mrs. Whitmore supplied quickly. "Ellen. She joined the household only recently." "Ellen," the dowager repeated slowly, testing the name as though it did not quite fit. Her dark eyes remained fixed on Eleanor's face, studying every feature with an attention that felt almost physical in its weight. "Come closer, girl. My eyes are not what they once were, and I wish to see you properly." Eleanor's heart pounded as she stepped forward, forcing herself to keep her expression composed despite the terror building inside her. The dowager studied her for a long moment, her gaze moving from Eleanor's eyes to the shape of her cheekbones to the particular way she held her chin, and Eleanor understood with sudden and complete certainty that this woman was seeing far more than a servant girl's face. "Extraordinary," Lady Ashcombe murmured, almost too quietly for anyone else to hear. Then louder, to the assembled household. "Well, I am tired from my journey, and wish to rest before dinner. Ellen, you will attend to my rooms personally. I find I prefer familiar faces, even new ones, over strangers fussing about my belongings." Mrs. Whitmore nodded quickly, and the household began to disperse, servants returning to their various duties while Julian escorted his grandmother toward the grand staircase. Eleanor remained frozen for a moment, her linen still clutched against her chest, dread pooling cold and heavy in her stomach. The dowager's request could not be coincidence. Something in her expression, in the careful way she had studied Eleanor's face, suggested recognition rather than simple curiosity. An hour later, Eleanor climbed the stairs to the dowager's rooms with a fresh pitcher of water and a growing sense of dread that made each step feel heavier than the last. She found Lady Ashcombe seated near the window, her traveling bonnet removed, to reveal silver hair pinned in an elegant knot, her sharp eyes fixed on the gardens below. "Set the water on the table, girl, and then close the door," the dowager said without turning. "I wish to speak with you privately." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she set down the pitcher and moved to close the heavy door, sealing them both inside the quiet room. When she turned back, Lady Ashcombe was watching her with an expression that held no anger, only a strange and searching curiosity. "You have your mother's eyes," the dowager said quietly. "I would know them anywhere, even after all these years. Charlotte Whitfield had exactly that shade of green, exactly that particular tilt at the corners when she smiled, though I notice you are not smiling now." Eleanor felt the last of her careful composure crumble entirely. "My lady," she began, her voice unsteady. "I can explain." "I do not require an explanation, child," Lady Ashcombe interrupted, though not unkindly. "I require only the truth. You are Eleanor Whitfield, are you not? Edmund and Charlotte's daughter?" Eleanor sank into a small chair near the window, her legs suddenly unable to support her further. "Yes, my lady," she whispered. "I am Eleanor Whitfield." The dowager studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and Eleanor braced herself for anger, for the summons of Mrs. Whitmore, for immediate and humiliating dismissal from the household she had deceived for nearly a week. Instead, Lady Ashcombe's severe features softened into something almost gentle. "Your mother was one of my dearest friends in this world, before circumstance and distance separated us," she said. "I have thought of her often over the years, and of your father, and I confess I have felt no small guilt that our family's friendship faded so completely, once fortune turned against the Whitfields. Tell me, child, why you have come to this house wearing a servant's dress and a false name." Eleanor's story spilled out slowly at first, then, in a rush, the words tumbling over each other as she explained her father's death, the crushing debts left behind, the desperate journey to Ashcombe Hall to plead for mercy on an old promise, and the terrible misunderstanding that had led Julian to press a servant's uniform into her hands before she could correct him. "I intended to explain everything that first night," Eleanor said, her voice trembling with the weight of days spent carrying this secret alone. "But something in his manner, in the coldness of his welcome, made me believe he would see only a beggar's daughter come to ask for charity. I thought perhaps if I stayed, even briefly, I might find a better way to make him understand our family's history, rather than simply arriving as another debt to be dismissed." Lady Ashcombe listened without interruption, her sharp eyes never leaving Eleanor's face, and when the story finally ended, she was quiet for a long moment, considering. You have shown remarkable courage, if perhaps questionable judgment, the dowager said finally. Living as a servant in this house, enduring labor you were never raised to perform, all to protect your family's dignity, rather than beg outright for charity. I confess I find myself more impressed than troubled by your deception, though I imagine my grandson would not share that sentiment if he learned the truth today. You do not intend to tell him? Eleanor asked, hope and fear tangling together in her voice. Not yet, Lady Ashcombe said, a faint and knowing smile touching her lips. I find myself curious, child. My grandson has grown so consumed by duty and debt these past years that he has forgotten how to simply be a man, how to trust his own judgment about people rather than their circumstances. I wish to see how his character reveals itself while he believes he speaks only to a servant girl, before the weight of your name and your family's troubles enters the conversation. Eleanor stared at the dowager, uncertain whether to feel relief or fresh alarm at this unexpected turn. You wish me to continue the deception, my lady? I wish you to continue exactly as you have been, for a little while longer, Lady Ashcombe said. I have watched my grandson carry the full weight of this estate alone since his father's death, and I have watched it harden something in him that was once softer, more open. If a servant girl named Ellen can remind him of that softness before Eleanor Whitfield ever enters the conversation, then I believe it will serve us all far better in the end. Do you trust me in this, child? Eleanor considered the request carefully, weighing the risk of continued deception against the strange comfort of having an ally within the household at last, someone who knew the full truth and had chosen mercy rather than exposure. I trust you, my lady, she said finally, though I confess I do not fully understand your reasoning. You will in time, the dowager said, rising slowly from her chair with the aid of her cane. For now, say nothing to my grandson, and continue your duties as you have been. I will watch closely, and when the moment is right, I will decide how and when the truth should be revealed. Until then, this remains a secret between the two of us alone. Eleanor nodded, though uncertainty still churned in her stomach as she left the dowager's rooms that afternoon. The relief of having her secret known by someone who did not intend immediate exposure was tangled with a fresh and complicated fear, the fear of what might happen when the truth finally did emerge, and whether Julian Ashcombe would see her courage as Lady Ashcombe had, or whether he would see only weeks of careful lies told to his face. Over the following days, Eleanor found herself watched more closely by the dowager than by anyone else in the household. Lady Ashcombe requested her presence frequently, calling her to read aloud from correspondence her aging eyes struggled to manage, or to accompany her on slow walks through the gardens while Julian attended to estate business elsewhere. During these quiet hours, the dowager spoke often of the old friendship between the Whitfield and Ashcombe families, of summers spent together before circumstance had pulled them apart, of Eleanor's mother as a young woman full of laughter and quick wit. Your mother once climbed the old oak tree behind this very house on a dare from my late husband, Lady Ashcombe said one afternoon as they walked slowly along a garden path lined with late-blooming roses, tore her best dress entirely and did not care one bit, laughing the whole way down. I have not thought of that memory in years, and yet seeing your face brings it back as though it happened only yesterday. Eleanor found comfort in these stories, small pieces of her mother's youth she had never known, offered generously by a woman who had chosen kindness over exposure despite every reason to do otherwise. Yet even as her bond with the dowager deepened, Eleanor remained acutely aware of Julian's growing attention toward her, an attention that felt increasingly dangerous given the secret now standing between them. She caught him watching her more often during those days, his gray eyes following her across rooms with an expression she could not quite name, something between curiosity and reluctant fascination. Once, as she helped arrange flowers for the dinner table under the dowager's careful direction, she looked up to find him standing in the doorway, watching the easy way his grandmother spoke with her, the warmth in Lady Ashcombe's usually severe expression whenever Eleanor was near. There was another matter troubling Eleanor during those days, one she could not raise even with the dowager, though it weighed on her constantly. Her mother remained alone at the cottage, waiting for word that might never come, uncertain whether her daughter had reached Ashcombe Hall safely, or whether the debt collectors had already begun proceedings to seize what little remained of their home. Eleanor had managed to send one brief letter through a passing tradesman in the village, assuring her mother that she was safe and that matters were progressing, though she had not dared to explain the strange and complicated truth of her circumstances, fearing the letter might fall into the wrong hands before it ever reached its destination. The dowager noticed her distraction one afternoon as they sat together in the small morning room, Eleanor's needle pausing mid-stitch over a piece of mending while her thoughts drifted far from the room around her. "You are troubled, child," Lady Ashcombe observed, setting aside her own correspondence to study Eleanor more closely. More troubled than usual, I think. Tell me what weighs on you. My mother remains alone at our cottage, my lady, Eleanor admitted quietly. I do not know how much longer the debt collectors will wait before taking action against our home. I fear every day that passes here, even in service of your plan, may cost her the roof over her head. Lady Ashcombe considered this for a long moment, her sharp eyes softening with genuine concern. This I can remedy, without revealing your identity to my grandson, she said finally. I will send word to my own solicitor this very afternoon, instructing him to quietly delay any action against the Whitfield property until matters here are properly resolved. He owes me several favors, and this is precisely the sort of quiet intervention he is skilled at arranging. Relief flooded through Eleanor so suddenly that tears sprang unbidden to her eyes. My lady, I do not know how to thank you for such kindness. You may thank me by trusting my judgment a little longer, the dowager said, though her tone had gentled considerably. I know this deception grows heavier with each passing day, child, and I do not ask you to bear it lightly. But I promise you, the moment is coming when all of this will resolve itself, one way or another, and I believe the outcome will be far better than you currently dare to hope. That evening, as promised, Lady Ashcombe's letter departed for her solicitor in London, carried by a trusted messenger under strict instructions of discretion. Eleanor watched the rider disappear down the long drive from her small window above the kitchen garden, a small measure of her constant worry finally easing, even as new complications continued to gather around her at Ashcombe Hall itself. Word soon arrived that Julian's cousin, Lord Gerald Pembroke, intended to visit within the fortnight, ostensibly to pay his respects to the dowager during her extended stay, though Alice confided to Eleanor one evening that the household staff harbored no illusions about the true purpose of his visit. He's after the estate, plain as day, Alice whispered as they prepared for bed in their small shared room. Everyone below stairs knows it, even if the family pretends otherwise. Lord Pembroke has been circling this inheritance since old Lord Ashcombe passed, waiting for any sign that Julian might stumble. Some say he's already been speaking to solicitors about contesting certain provisions in the will, though nothing has come of it yet. Eleanor absorbed this information with growing unease, some instinct warning her that Pembroke's arrival would complicate matters far beyond the careful balance she and the dowager had constructed. She had glimpsed the man once before, years earlier, at a social gathering her family had attended before their fortunes collapsed entirely, though she doubted he would remember a young girl from a family whose name had since faded into irrelevance among society's upper circles. Or so she hoped, lying awake that night while Alice's breathing settled into the steady rhythm of sleep beside her. Eleanor stared at the low ceiling above her narrow bed and considered the tangled web of secrets now surrounding her, the dowager's knowledge, Julian's growing suspicion, her mother's precarious safety, and now the looming arrival of a cousin whose ambitions threatened to unravel everything before the dowager's careful plan could reach its intended conclusion. Whatever peace she had found in Lady Ashcombe's protection felt suddenly fragile, a candle flame flickering against a wind she could not yet see but sensed gathering just beyond the horizon. My grandmother has taken quite a liking to you, Julian observed later that evening, finding Eleanor alone in the corridor, as she carried a tray toward the kitchen. She rarely warms to new staff so quickly. You must have made quite an impression. Eleanor's cheeks warmed under his attention, guilt and pleasure tangling uncomfortably together. Your grandmother is very kind, my lord. She is many things, Julian said, a faint smile touching his features, but kind is not always the first word I would choose. Careful, perhaps. Deliberate. She does nothing without reason, and I confess I have wondered what reason lies behind her sudden fondness for you. Eleanor's heart pounded, certain for one terrible moment that he had somehow guessed the truth already, but his expression held only curiosity, not suspicion, and she forced herself to answer lightly, though her voice trembled slightly on the words. Perhaps she simply enjoys good company during a long visit, my lord. Perhaps, Julian said, though his gaze lingered on her a moment longer than necessary before he continued down the corridor, leaving Eleanor alone with her tray and her secrets, and a growing certainty that the careful balance she and the dowager had constructed could not possibly hold for much longer. Lightning split the sky directly over Ashcombe Hall, and Eleanor dropped the basket of eggs she had been carrying across the yard, sending them scattering across the muddy ground just as the first true violence of the storm broke loose overhead. She had known the clouds looked threatening when she left the kitchen that afternoon, but Mrs. Whitmore had insisted the eggs be collected before dinner preparations began, and Eleanor had not expected the storm to arrive with such sudden and overwhelming force. Rain fell in sheets within seconds, soaking through her dress completely, and the wind howled loud enough to drown out her own startled cry as she abandoned the ruined eggs and ran for the nearest shelter, the old stone stable at the edge of the yard. She burst through the stable door dripping and breathless, only to find she was not alone. Julian stood near one of the horse stalls, having apparently sought the same shelter while checking on a mare due to foal within the week. He turned at the sound of the door, his expression shifting from surprise to something softer, as he took in her drenched and disheveled appearance. "You look like you fought the storm and lost," he said, a faint smile touching his features as he crossed toward her, pulling a folded blanket from a nearby shelf and offering it to her without hesitation. "I lost an entire basket of eggs in the process," Eleanor said, accepting the blanket gratefully and wrapping it around her shoulders, her teeth chattering slightly from the sudden chill of the rain. "Mrs. Whitmore will not be pleased." "Mrs. Whitmore will survive the loss of a few eggs," Julian said, moving to close the stable door more securely against the wind, "though I confess I am somewhat responsible for the timing. The mare has been restless all afternoon, and I wanted to check on her before the storm grew worse. I did not expect company." They stood together near the stall for a long moment, the storm raging outside while the mare shifted nervously within, and Eleanor found herself acutely aware of how close Julian stood, of the easy warmth in his expression that felt entirely different from the cold authority he had shown her on that first rainy night weeks earlier. "She's beautiful," Eleanor said, nodding toward the mare, grateful for a topic that might ease the sudden tension building in the small space between them. "Her name is Winter," Julian said, moving to stroke the mare's neck gently, his voice softening in a way Eleanor had rarely heard from him. "She was my mother's favorite horse. Before she passed, I have kept her long past her breeding years out of sentiment more than practicality, though this foal will be her last." Eleanor's chest tightened at the unexpected vulnerability in his voice, this small glimpse into a private grief she had not known he carried. "I am sorry for your loss, my lord." "It was many years ago now," Julian said, though something in his expression suggested the wound had never fully healed. "My father managed well enough afterward, at least on the surface, but I believe the estate's troubles began in earnest after her passing. He grew careless with money in his grief, generous to a fault with old friends and struggling families, promising more than the estate could truly afford to give." He paused, glancing at Eleanor with an expression she could not quite read. "I have spent years since trying to correct those mistakes, though I confess I sometimes wonder if I have grown too hard in the process, too quick to see every promise as a burden rather than a bond worth honoring." Eleanor thought of the letter hidden beneath her narrow bed, of the promise her father had made with his, and felt a fresh wave of guilt at how easily this man spoke to her now, unaware that the very deception standing between them concerned exactly the kind of promise he described. "I do not think you hard, my lord," she said quietly. "I have watched you these past weeks, and I believe you carry your burdens with more care than you credit yourself for." Julian turned to look at her fully then, something shifting in his gray eyes, a warmth that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. "You speak with remarkable confidence for a servant addressing her employer," he said, though there was no sharpness in the observation, only genuine curiosity. "I find myself wondering, more each day, exactly who you truly are, Ellen. There is something about you that does not fit the role you have taken on, something in the way you speak and think and carry yourself that suggests a very different history than the one you have shared with this household." Eleanor's heart pounded painfully, torn between the urge to confess everything in this quiet, storm-lit moment and the fear of what such a confession might destroy. "Perhaps circumstances change people more than history does, my lord," she said carefully. "Perhaps I am simply someone who has learned to adapt to whatever situation life presents." "Perhaps," Julian said, though his expression suggested he was not entirely satisfied with the answer. He studied her for a long moment, the rain still hammering against the stable roof above them, and then, almost as though the words escaped before he could stop them, he added quietly, "Whoever you truly are, Ellen, I find myself grateful for your presence in this house. These past weeks have been the first in a very long time that I have not felt entirely alone in carrying this estate's weight." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and unguarded, and Eleanor felt something shift dangerously in her own chest, an answering warmth she had not expected and was not certain she should allow herself to feel. Before she could respond, the stable door banged open again, admitting a soaked and breathless stable hand who announced that the storm had brought down a tree near the eastern fence line, requiring Julian's immediate attention. The moment broke as quickly as it had formed, Julian's expression shifting back into the practical concern of a man responsible for an entire estate, and Eleanor watched him depart into the storm with a strange ache in her chest that she did not fully understand, or perhaps understood all too well, and was not yet ready to admit. Over the following days, their encounters grew more frequent, though never again quite so unguarded as that stormy afternoon in the stable. Julian began seeking her out during quiet moments, finding reasons to linger in rooms where she worked, asking her opinion on matters ranging from tenant disputes to the proper arrangement of his grandmother's favorite flowers, treating her, Eleanor slowly realized, less like a servant and more like a confidant whose judgment he had come to value. One evening, as she mended a torn hem on one of the dowager's dresses in the small sewing room off the servants' hall, Julian appeared in the doorway, watching her work in silence for several minutes before speaking. "You sew with remarkable skill," he observed, moving to sit in a chair near the window, apparently in no hurry to state whatever business had brought him to find her. "My mother taught me," Eleanor said, then caught herself, aware that the admission revealed more of her true history than she intended. "That is, the woman who raised me placed great value on such skills." Julian's gaze sharpened slightly at the correction, though he did not press the matter further, choosing instead to watch her fingers move deftly through the fabric. "I have been thinking," he said after a moment, "about the letter my father left concerning an old family friendship, one I have not yet fully honored despite my intentions to do so. The Whitfield family, they were called. I have been reviewing the accounts these past days, trying to determine how best to fulfill my father's promise to them, though I confess the matter has proven more complicated than I initially believed." Eleanor's needle stilled entirely, her heart pounding so loudly she felt certain he must hear it. "What complications, my lord?" "My cousin, Lord Pembroke, arrives within days," Julian said, his expression darkening slightly. "He has made it clear he believes the estate cannot afford such generosity toward families outside our immediate concern, and he has begun suggesting, none too subtly, that I ought to consider a more advantageous marriage instead, one that would secure the estate's finances through connection rather than through honoring what he considers foolish old debts." "And what do you believe, my lord?" Eleanor asked, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the turmoil building inside her. Julian was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes distant as though weighing something significant. "I believe my father's words should mean something, even after his death," he said finally. "I believe the Whitfield family deserves whatever help I am able to offer, regardless of what my cousin believes serves the estate's interests better. But I confess, Ellen, that I have also begun to wonder whether my heart has already been claimed by someone entirely unexpected, someone whose true history I do not yet fully understand, and that uncertainty complicates matters my cousin would find far more troubling than any old debt." Eleanor's hands trembled as she set aside her sewing, unable to meet his gaze fully, torn between the overwhelming desire to confess everything in this quiet moment, and the fear of what Pembroke's imminent arrival might mean for the careful truth still waiting to unfold. She thought of Lady Ashcombe's warning, her insistence that the moment for revelation had not yet arrived, and forced herself to hold her tongue despite every instinct urging her otherwise. "Whatever your heart has claimed, my lord," she said carefully, "I believe you already know the honorable path forward, even if circumstances make that path more difficult than you might wish." Julian studied her for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them in the quiet room, before he rose from his chair with a small, almost rueful smile. "You have a gift for offering wisdom without quite answering the question asked, Ellen. I begin to suspect that gift is entirely intentional." He left the room before she could respond, and Eleanor sat alone with her mending, the dowager's dress forgotten in her lap, her thoughts consumed entirely by the growing certainty that whatever careful balance had sustained her deception these past weeks was drawing rapidly toward its inevitable and dangerous conclusion. She found Lady Ashcombe later that evening in the small library, a book open unread upon her lap while she gazed thoughtfully into the fire. Eleanor hesitated in the doorway, uncertain whether to disturb the dowager's quiet reflection, but the older woman looked up immediately, as though she had been expecting the visit. "Come in, child, and close the door," Lady Ashcombe said. "You have the look of a woman carrying news too heavy to hold alone." Eleanor sank into the chair opposite the dowager and recounted the conversation in the sewing room, her voice growing unsteady as she described Julian's near confession, his growing suspicion, and the looming shadow of Pembroke's arrival. Lady Ashcombe listened without interruption, her sharp eyes reflecting the firelight, until Eleanor finished and sat waiting, uncertain what response to expect. "My grandson has always been a man who feels deeply, even when he works hard to appear otherwise," the dowager said finally. "I am not surprised his heart has begun to speak louder than his caution, though I confess I had not expected matters to move quite so quickly toward this point." "What should I do, my lady?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I fear I am no longer certain I can maintain this deception, not when he speaks to me with such honesty, and I am able to offer him nothing but careful half-truths in return." Lady Ashcombe reached across the small distance between their chairs and took Eleanor's hand in her own weathered fingers, a gesture of comfort that surprised Eleanor with its warmth. "You have carried this burden with more grace than I expected, child, and I do not intend to let it crush you entirely. I have been watching my grandson closely these past weeks, and I believe the moment for truth is approaching faster than either of us anticipated. Pembroke's arrival may prove the very catalyst that forces matters into the open, whether we are fully prepared or not." "You do not intend to tell him before Pembroke arrives?" Eleanor asked, torn between relief and fresh anxiety at the thought of what her cousin's presence might bring. "I intend to watch carefully and choose the right moment, as I have always intended," Lady Ashcombe said, her grip on Eleanor's hand tightening slightly with reassurance. "But I will not allow Gerald Pembroke to expose you in some cruel and calculated fashion, designed purely to serve his own ambitions. If the truth must come out before I judge the timing ideal, I promise you it will come out on terms that protect you and your family's dignity, not on terms that serve his scheming." Eleanor found some measure of comfort in the dowager's words, though the anxious knot in her stomach refused to fully unwind. She thought of her mother, still waiting at the cottage for word of her daughter's fate, and of the fragile promise Julian's father had made so many years ago, a promise now tangled hopelessly with matters of the heart that no one could have anticipated when Eleanor first arrived soaked and desperate at the gates of Ashcombe Hall. "Thank you, my lady," Eleanor said quietly. "I do not know how I would have survived these past weeks without your kindness." "You would have survived, I have no doubt," Lady Ashcombe said, a faint smile touching her weathered features. "You are your mother's daughter, after all, and Charlotte Whitfield was never a woman easily broken by circumstance. But I am glad, nonetheless, that you have not needed to face this trial entirely alone." As Eleanor left the library that evening, the weight of the coming days settling heavily upon her shoulders, she could not shake the feeling that whatever quiet peace remained in her disguised existence at Ashcombe Hall was rapidly running out, carried away as surely as the storm clouds that had gathered and broken over the estate earlier that same week. Lord Gerald Pembroke's carriage rolled up the long drive of Ashcombe Hall on a bright afternoon that felt entirely wrong for the storm his arrival was about to unleash, and Eleanor felt the danger the moment she caught her first glimpse of his face through the drawing-room window. She recognized him instantly, despite the years that had passed since she last saw him at a summer gathering her family had attended before their fortunes collapsed entirely. He had been a young man then, sharp-featured and calculating even in his youth, and time had only sharpened those qualities further, carving his handsome face into something colder and more deliberate. Eleanor kept to the background as the household assembled to greet him, hoping her position among the serving staff and the passage of years might be enough to prevent recognition. For the first hour of his visit, her hope seemed justified. Pembroke barely glanced at the servants moving through the entrance hall, his attention fixed entirely on Julian and the dowager as he offered smooth compliments and careful observations about the estate's condition. But that evening, as Eleanor helped serve dinner in the grand dining hall, she felt his gaze land on her with sudden and unmistakable weight. She kept her eyes lowered, focusing entirely on the wine she poured into his glass, but she could feel him studying her face with growing intensity, his expression shifting slowly from idle curiosity to dawning recognition. "Forgive me," Pembroke said suddenly, setting down his fork and studying Eleanor openly as she moved to serve the next course. "But have we met before? Your face seems remarkably familiar to me, though I cannot immediately place the circumstance." Eleanor's heart plummeted, though she forced her expression to remain neutral. "I do not believe so, my lord. I have been in service here only a short while." "Curious," Pembroke said, though he let the matter drop for the remainder of the meal, his eyes returning to study her whenever he believed she was not watching. Julian, seated across the table, seemed to notice his cousin's attention, though he said nothing during the meal itself. Eleanor caught his gaze once, briefly, and saw something protective flicker across his features before he returned his attention to the conversation Pembroke had resumed about estate matters and inheritance provisions. Later that night, as Eleanor helped clear the final dishes from the dining hall, Pembroke found her alone in the corridor outside the kitchen, his expression no longer masked with polite curiosity, but sharpened into something far more dangerous. "Eleanor Whitfield," he said quietly, the name falling from his lips like a blade unsheathing. "I thought I recognized you, despite the years and the rather unusual circumstances of our reunion. Your father's daughter, working as a common servant in my cousin's household. How remarkably far the family has fallen." Eleanor's blood turned to ice, her hands trembling around the tray she carried. "I do not know what you mean, my lord. My name is Ellen." "Do not insult my intelligence," Pembroke said, his voice dropping lower still, though his eyes gleamed with something close to delight at her obvious fear. "I attended your family's summer gatherings myself, years ago, before your father's foolish investments ruined everything he had built. I remember you quite clearly, though you were younger then, and considerably better dressed." Eleanor set down her tray carefully, forcing herself to think clearly despite the panic clawing at her chest. "What do you want, Lord Pembroke?" "What I want," Pembroke said, stepping closer with a predatory smile, "is quite simple. I want my cousin's estate, and I have been searching for the right opportunity to secure it ever since our uncle's foolish will left Julian in control of what should rightfully belong to a more capable heir. Your presence here, disguised under a false name, deceiving my cousin and the entire household for reasons I can only imagine, presents precisely the kind of scandal that might finally convince Julian's remaining supporters that he lacks the judgment necessary to manage this estate properly. You would ruin an innocent woman's reputation simply to further your own ambitions," Eleanor asked, horror and anger tangling together in her voice. "I would do considerably worse than that, if it served my purposes," Pembroke said coldly. "But I am, at heart, a reasonable man. I am prepared to offer you a choice. Leave Ashcombe Hall quietly tonight, before the dinner I intend to host for the neighboring families in 3 days' time, and I will say nothing of your true identity to anyone. Remain, and I will expose your deception publicly, before the very guests my cousin hopes to impress, humiliating both you and Julian beyond any hope of recovery." Eleanor stared at him, revulsion and fear churning together in her stomach. "And if I choose to tell Lord Ashcombe the truth myself, before you have the chance to twist it into scandal?" Pembroke's smile widened, cold and certain. "You may try, if you wish. But I doubt my cousin's affection for you, whatever foolish sentiment has grown between you these past weeks, will survive the discovery that you have lied to him for the entirety of your acquaintance. Men do not easily forgive such deceptions, Miss Whitfield, however sympathetic your original reasons might have been." He left her standing alone in the corridor, the tray forgotten at her feet, her mind racing through every possible path forward and finding each one blocked by some fresh and terrible obstacle. She thought of seeking out Lady Ashcombe immediately, but the hour was late, and some instinct warned her that Pembroke might be watching to see exactly what she would do next. Eleanor spent the following 2 days in a state of constant, quiet terror, performing her duties mechanically while her mind churned endlessly through impossible calculations. She avoided Pembroke whenever possible, though his eyes seemed to find her in every room she entered, a silent and constant reminder of the threat hanging over her future. She considered fleeing Ashcombe Hall entirely, disappearing before Pembroke's deadline arrived and sparing everyone the scandal his exposure would bring, though the thought of leaving without ever telling Julian the truth herself, without ever explaining the reasons behind her deception, left her feeling hollow with grief she had not expected to feel so intensely. She finally sought out Lady Ashcombe on the second evening, finding the Dowager alone in her rooms and recounting Pembroke's threat in a voice made unsteady by exhaustion and fear. The old woman's expression darkened considerably as she listened, her hands tightening around her cane with barely restrained anger. "That man has always been a viper wearing a gentleman's clothing," Lady Ashcombe said when Eleanor finished. "I had hoped his ambitions would remain contained to petty scheming with solicitors, not cruel threats against innocent young women. This changes matters considerably, child. We cannot allow him the satisfaction of exposing you on his own terms, in his own carefully chosen moment designed to cause maximum damage." "What should I do, my lady?" Eleanor asked, desperation coloring her voice. "I considered leaving tonight, before he can carry out his threat, sparing everyone the scandal entirely." "Absolutely not," Lady Ashcombe said sharply. "Running away now would only confirm every ugly suspicion Pembroke hopes to plant, and it would rob you of any chance to tell your own story on your own terms. No, child, we must move more swiftly than he anticipates. I will speak with Julian myself, tonight, before Pembroke has the opportunity to twist this narrative into something poisonous." That night, as Eleanor lay sleepless in her narrow bed, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside her small room, and rose quickly, pulling a shawl around her shoulders as she opened the door to find Julian standing there, his expression unreadable in the dim candlelight, a folded letter clutched in his hand. "My grandmother wishes to speak with us both," he said quietly, his voice giving away nothing of what he already knew or suspected. "She said the matter could not wait until morning." Eleanor's heart pounded painfully as she followed him down the darkened corridor toward the Dowager's rooms, uncertain whether Lady Ashcombe had already revealed the truth, or whether this summons would force Eleanor herself to finally speak the words she had carried in silence for so many weeks. As they walked, Julian glanced at her sideways, something troubled and searching in his expression. "My cousin came to me this evening," he said quietly, with rather startling accusations about the true identity of a certain servant in this household. I did not believe him at first. I told him he was simply grasping at scandal to serve his own ambitions, as he so often does. But something in his certainty has left me unable to dismiss the matter entirely, and I find myself hoping, quite desperately, that whatever truth awaits us in my grandmother's rooms tonight will not be the betrayal my cousin seems so eager for me to believe. Eleanor's throat tightened, tears threatening at the raw honesty in his voice, the vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to show. "Julian," she said softly, using his given name for the first time since her arrival, the word feeling both terrifying and strangely right upon her tongue. "Whatever you learn tonight, I need you to understand that everything I have felt these past weeks, every moment of genuine connection between us, was entirely true, regardless of the name I have carried while feeling it." He stopped walking, turning to study her face in the dim corridor light, something shifting behind his gray eyes that Eleanor could not quite read, hope and fear and confusion all tangled together. Before he could respond, they reached the dowager's door, and Lady Ashcombe's voice called them inside, the moment of private confession swallowed by the larger reckoning that awaited them both. Inside, the dowager sat waiting near the fire, her expression grave but composed, and beside her, Eleanor's stomach dropped entirely as she recognized a second figure seated in the shadows near the window. It was her own mother, Charlotte Whitfield, her traveling cloak still damp from the journey, her eyes filling with tears the moment they landed on her daughter's face. "I sent for her 3 days ago," Lady Ashcombe said quietly, "before Pembroke's threat ever reached my ears, though I confess the timing now feels almost providential. I believed it was time this family's truth was spoken properly, by the people who best understood it, rather than left to unravel through the cruel machinations of a man who cares nothing for the people he intends to harm." Julian stood frozen in the doorway beside Eleanor, his gaze moving slowly between the weeping woman near the window, his grandmother's grave expression, and Eleanor's own tear-filled eyes, the full shape of the truth beginning to assemble itself in his mind, even before a single word of explanation had been spoken aloud. "Eleanor," Charlotte Whitfield whispered, rising from her chair and crossing the room to embrace her daughter, her arms trembling with relief and worry combined. "I have been half mad with fear these past weeks, not knowing whether you had arrived safely, whether the matter had been settled, whether I would ever see you again. Lady Ashcombe's letter arrived only days ago, explaining everything, and I came as quickly as the roads allowed." Eleanor returned her mother's embrace fiercely, tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks, the weight of weeks of careful deception and constant fear breaking loose all at once in the safety of her mother's arms. Over her mother's shoulder, she watched Julian's face carefully, searching for some sign of what he felt in this moment of revelation, but his expression remained carefully guarded, unreadable even to someone who had spent weeks learning to read every small shift in his features. "Someone will explain to me," Julian said finally, his voice quiet but tight with barely controlled emotion, "exactly what has happened in my own household these past weeks, and why I am only now learning that the woman I have grown to trust and admire has been living under a false name this entire time." Lady Ashcombe rose from her chair, moving to stand between her grandson and the two Whitfield women, her expression steady despite the tension crackling through the room. "Sit down, Julian, and I will tell you everything, from the very beginning. This is not a story of deception meant to harm you, but one born entirely of desperation and circumstance, and I believe once you hear it fully, you will understand why matters unfolded as they did." Julian sank slowly into a chair near the fire, his gaze never leaving Eleanor's face, and Lady Ashcombe began to recount the story from the moment Eleanor had first arrived at Ashcombe Hall, soaked and desperate, mistaken for a servant girl before she could explain her true purpose. She spoke of the crushing debts left by Edmund Whitfield's death, of the old promise between their families that Eleanor had come to invoke, and of the terrible misunderstanding that had led her to accept a servant's dress rather than correct Julian's assumption in that first cold encounter. "I recognized her within moments of my own arrival," the dowager continued, "and I confess the choice to keep her secret was entirely my own, made against her initial hesitation. I wished to see how you would treat a woman you believed beneath your station, Julian, before the weight of her family name and their troubles ever entered the conversation. I wished to know whether the man you have become these past years, hardened by duty and debt, still possessed the capacity for genuine kindness and connection that circumstance alone should not determine." Julian was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes moving between his grandmother's steady gaze and Eleanor's anxious, tear-streaked face. "You tested me," he said finally, something sharp entering his voice. "Both of you, together, allowed me to believe a lie for weeks, watching to see how I would respond, without once considering that I might have wished to know the truth from the very beginning." "Julian," Eleanor began, stepping forward despite her mother's restraining hand on her arm. "Please understand, I intended to tell you the truth that very first night. But you were so cold, so certain in your judgment before I could speak a single word, that I feared telling you plainly would earn me nothing but dismissal and humiliation. I made a choice born of fear and desperation, not calculation, and I have regretted the deception every single day since, even as I found myself unable to see a safer path forward." "And these past weeks," Julian said, his voice still tight with hurt and confusion. "Every conversation in the stable, every quiet moment in the sewing room, every word you spoke about my father's mistakes and my own struggles with the estate's finances, none of it was entirely honest. You knew the whole time that you yourself were the very promise I was trying to determine how best to honor." "Every feeling was honest," Eleanor said fiercely, her voice breaking slightly despite her effort to remain composed. "Only my name was hidden, Julian, not my heart. Everything I felt for you, every moment I treasured despite the fear and guilt weighing on me constantly, was entirely true. I did not plan to fall in love with you while wearing a servant's dress and a false name, but I did, completely and without reservation, and that truth has never once wavered beneath whatever lies my circumstances forced upon me." The room fell silent at her admission, the fire crackling softly in the grate, and Julian sat very still, studying her face, as though searching for some final confirmation, before allowing himself to believe what he had heard. Charlotte Whitfield watched the exchange with anxious hope, while Lady Ashcombe remained silent, having said her piece, and now content to let the two younger people find their own way through the tangled truth between them. "There is more you should know," Lady Ashcombe added quietly after a moment, breaking the tense silence. "Your cousin discovered Eleanor's identity 2 days ago, and has threatened to expose her publicly at the dinner he intends to attend within 3 days, hoping the resulting scandal will convince your neighbors and creditors that your judgment cannot be trusted. I believe he intends to use this discovery as a weapon against you both, and we must decide, tonight, how best to answer that threat, before he has the opportunity to strike first." Julian's expression darkened considerably at this news, his earlier hurt shifting rapidly into something colder and more determined. "Pembroke threatened you," he said, turning to Eleanor with fresh intensity in his gaze. "He sought to use your family's misfortune, your courage in coming here despite everything you risked, as a weapon to destroy both your reputation and my standing among the very people whose trust I have worked years to rebuild. He offered me a choice," Eleanor said quietly, "leave quietly before his dinner, or remain and face public humiliation, designed to damage us both beyond recovery. And yet you remained," and Julian said, something softening in his expression, despite the anger still evident beneath the surface. "Even knowing what he threatened, you chose to stay rather than flee in the night." "I could not leave without telling you the truth myself," Eleanor said. "Whatever consequences followed, I owed you that much honesty, even if it came later than it should have." Julian rose slowly from his chair and crossed the room to stand before her, his gray eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "Then we will face my cousin's threat together, openly and honestly, rather than allowing him the satisfaction of controlling how and when this truth is revealed," he said finally. "I have spent years honoring my father's promises to the families he cared for, Eleanor, and I do not intend to let Gerald Pembroke twist the fulfillment of one such promise into a weapon against the very woman who has taught me, these past weeks, how to trust and care for someone beyond the endless calculations of duty and debt." Lady Ashcombe smiled quietly from her chair by the fire, satisfaction evident in her expression as she watched her carefully orchestrated plan reach precisely the resolution she had hoped for from the very beginning, though the true test of that resolution still awaited them in the days ahead, when Gerald Pembroke would arrive expecting scandal, and find instead a united front he had never anticipated facing. Candles blazed in every fixture of the great dining hall as carriages rolled up the drive of Ashcombe Hall, delivering the neighboring families Gerald Pembroke had specifically requested be invited, each one a person of standing whose opinion could shape or shatter Julian's reputation within the county. Eleanor stood in her own room that evening, no longer dressed in the gray servant's uniform she had worn for weeks, but in a gown of deep green silk that Lady Ashcombe had insisted be prepared for her, a gown that fit as though it had been made for exactly this moment of reckoning. Her mother helped fasten the final buttons at her back, her hands trembling slightly with nervous anticipation. "You do not have to do this tonight, my darling," Charlotte Whitfield said softly, studying her daughter's reflection in the small mirror. "We could still leave quietly, avoid the confrontation entirely, and let matters settle without such a public spectacle." "I have run and hidden long enough, Mother," Eleanor said, turning to face her with newfound resolve, steadying her voice. "Pembroke intended to expose me as a scandal, a servant girl caught in a lie. Tonight, I intend to walk into that dining hall as exactly who I am, Eleanor Whitfield, and let him discover that the truth he hoped would destroy me holds no power over a woman who has nothing left to hide." Downstairs, the guests had already begun arriving, and Eleanor could hear the low murmur of conversation and laughter drifting up through the grand staircase as she and her mother prepared to descend. Julian met them at the top of the stairs, dressed formally for the evening, his expression softening the moment he saw Eleanor in her true finery for the first time. "You look every bit the woman I always sensed you were, even beneath the servant's dress," he said quietly, offering his arm. "Are you certain you wish to proceed this way, tonight, before all these guests? We could still find a quieter path forward, if you prefer." "I am certain," Eleanor said, taking his offered arm with steady confidence. "Let your cousin have his dinner and his audience. Let him try his scandal. I will not shrink from the truth any longer." They descended together, Julian and Eleanor arm in arm, Charlotte Whitfield following close behind, and Lady Ashcombe waiting for them at the base of the staircase with a satisfied gleam in her sharp eyes. The dowager had dressed with particular care that evening, every inch the formidable matriarch prepared for battle, and she fell into step beside them as they made their way toward the dining hall where the assembled guests waited. Gerald Pembroke stood near the fireplace when they entered, engaged in easy conversation with several of the visiting families, his expression confident and pleased with himself, clearly anticipating the moment when he would reveal Eleanor's secret before this carefully assembled audience. His eyes found her immediately as she entered on Julian's arm, and Eleanor watched surprise flicker briefly across his features at her transformed appearance, quickly masked by renewed determination. Dinner proceeded through its early courses with the surface pleasantness such gatherings demanded, though Eleanor felt the tension building steadily beneath the polite conversation, Pembroke's gaze returning to her again and again, clearly searching for the right moment to strike. She forced herself to eat, to converse when spoken to appear entirely at ease despite the anxious pounding of her heart, drawing strength from the steady presence of Julian beside her and her mother across the table. The moment came during the third course, as conversation had turned briefly to matters of local scandal and gossip among the assembled families. Pembroke set down his glass with deliberate care and turned his attention fully toward Eleanor, his voice carrying easily across the table to ensure every guest present would hear his words. "I find myself curious," he said, his tone light but his eyes sharp with malicious intent, "about our lovely guest this evening. Miss Eleanor Whitfield, is it not? I confess I was quite surprised to learn of her presence in this household, given that only weeks ago, she was employed here under an entirely different name, performing duties considerably beneath her actual station." A ripple of confused murmurs passed through the assembled guests, curious glances exchanged as they tried to make sense of Pembroke's pointed accusation. Eleanor felt her heart pound painfully, but forced herself to remain calm, meeting his gaze directly rather than looking away in shame as he clearly expected. "You are quite right, Lord Pembroke," Eleanor said, her voice steady and clear enough to carry across the silent dining hall. "I did indeed work in this household under the name Ellen for several weeks, performing duties as a servant while I searched for the right opportunity to speak with Lord Ashcombe about a matter of great importance to my family." The admission, offered so openly and without shame, seemed to catch Pembroke off guard, his confident expression flickering with momentary uncertainty before he pressed forward with renewed determination. "How remarkably candid of you to admit such deception before this company. I wonder whether your host was quite so pleased to learn he had been so thoroughly deceived by a woman he had come to trust." "There was no deception intended to harm anyone," Julian said, his voice cutting firmly across the table before Eleanor could respond, his tone carrying the full weight of his authority as head of the household. "Miss Whitfield arrived at Ashcombe Hall weeks ago to discuss a promise my late father made to her family, a promise I fully intend to honor. Through an unfortunate misunderstanding on my part, I mistook her for a servant awaiting employment before she had the opportunity to correct me, and circumstances led her to continue that arrangement rather than immediately reveal her true purpose." "How very convenient an explanation," Pembroke said, though his confidence had visibly diminished under the united front now facing him. "Regardless of the circumstances, cousin, surely you cannot deny that such deception, however it began, reflects poorly on the judgment of a household that failed to notice a fraud living within its own walls for weeks. Enough, Gerald. The voice that cut through the tension belonged to Lady Ashcombe, rising from her seat at the head of the table with the commanding presence of a woman who had run this estate long before either young man had been born. Every eye in the room turned toward her as she stood, her cane tapping once against the floor for emphasis, her expression carrying the full weight of decades spent commanding respect within these very walls. I have known this young woman's identity since the very first day of her arrival, the Dowager announced, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the silent dining hall. Eleanor Whitfield is the daughter of my dear friend Charlotte, whose family shared a bond with the Ashcombe household spanning generations, sealed through friendship and honor long before either of these young people were born. I recognized her immediately, and I chose, of my own accord, to allow her deception to continue for a time, believing it would reveal my grandson's true character far better than any formal introduction could accomplish. Gasps and murmurs spread through the assembled guests, and Pembroke's face had gone pale, the ground shifting beneath his carefully constructed scandal with every word the Dowager spoke. I watched my grandson treat a woman he believed to be a servant with genuine kindness and respect, Lady Ashcombe continued, long before he knew her true name or her family's connection to our own. I watched him honor his father's memory by refusing to abandon old promises simply because gold had grown scarce for those who once trusted the Ashcombe name. And I watched Eleanor Whitfield endure genuine hardship and labor with quiet dignity, rather than beg for charity she felt she had not earned. If either of these two young people deceived anyone in this matter, it was I who orchestrated that deception, and I offer no apology for it whatsoever. Pembroke rose from his chair, his composure fully abandoned now, desperation creeping into his voice as he realized the scandal he had so carefully planned was collapsing entirely, before the very audience meant to witness his triumph. Grandmother, surely you cannot condone such reckless behavior, regardless of your fondness for the girl's family. This entire household has been made to look foolish by this elaborate charade. The only person made to look foolish this evening, Gerald, Lady Ashcombe said coldly, turning her sharp gaze fully upon him, is you. I have known of your schemes to contest my grandson's inheritance for some time now, your quiet consultations with solicitors, your careful cultivation of doubt among our neighbors regarding Julian's judgment and capability. I had hoped you might abandon such petty ambitions on your own, but this evening's display has convinced me otherwise entirely. The Dowager's words landed like a physical blow, and Eleanor watched Pembroke's face shift from desperation to barely controlled fury as he realized the full extent of his exposure before the very guests he had hoped to turn against Julian. You threatened this young woman, Julian said, rising slowly from his own chair, his voice carrying quiet but unmistakable menace as he addressed his cousin directly. You told her to leave quietly or face public humiliation, hoping to either drive away a woman I had come to care for deeply, or create precisely this scene of scandal you engineered tonight. I will not pretend such behavior deserves anything less than complete condemnation, cousin, nor will I pretend our family connection excuses it. Pembroke opened his mouth to respond, some final desperate argument forming behind his eyes, but the assembled guests had already begun exchanging pointed glances and quiet murmurs, the tide of sympathy and judgment shifting decisively against him with every passing moment. Recognizing the battle thoroughly lost, he offered a stiff, humiliated bow and departed the dining hall without another word, his carriage summoned in haste as the remaining guests watched his hurried exit, with expressions ranging from satisfaction to quiet pity. Once the door had closed firmly behind him, silence settled over the dining hall for a long moment before Julian turned to face the remaining guests, his expression finally softening from its earlier hard authority into something warmer and more open. I owe you all a proper explanation, he said, and Miss Whitfield deserves better than to have her story revealed through my cousin's cruel machinations. He turned then to look directly at Eleanor, his gray eyes warm with an emotion she had glimpsed only in private moments before now displayed openly for all to witness. Eleanor Whitfield came to this house weeks ago carrying nothing but a letter and desperate hope, seeking only the honoring of an old promise between our families. What she found instead, and what I found in turn, was something neither of us anticipated nor sought, a connection built not on titles or fortune, but on genuine trust and understanding, forged even through the strangest of circumstances. He crossed the small distance between them and took her hand gently in his own, kneeling before the assembled guests with a formality that left the entire room breathless with anticipation. I do not intend to let false pride or my cousin's petty scheming stand between myself and the woman who has taught me more about honor and courage these past weeks than years of managing this estate ever did, Julian said, his voice steady, despite the emotion evident beneath his words. Eleanor Whitfield, whatever name you wore when we first met, my heart recognized something true in you from the very beginning. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife, and allow me the privilege of honoring my father's promise to your family in the truest way possible? Tears filled Eleanor's eyes as she looked down at him, the assembled guests around them entirely forgotten, her mother's soft gasp of joy, and Lady Ashcombe's satisfied smile fading into distant background as the full weight of the moment settled over her. Yes, she said, her voice breaking with happiness she had not allowed herself to fully imagine during weeks of fear and careful deception. Yes, Julian, I will marry you. The dining hall erupted into applause and delighted exclamations as Julian rose and drew Eleanor into an embrace, the weeks of hidden identity and quiet suffering finally giving way to open celebration among friends and family who now understood the full and remarkable truth of the woman who had arrived at their gates as a stranger and would soon depart as the future mistress of Ashcombe Hall. Later that evening, after the guests had finally departed and the excited celebrations had quieted into peaceful exhaustion, Eleanor found the old gray servant's dress still folded carefully in her small room above the kitchen garden, the very garment Julian had pressed into her hands on that first rainy night so many weeks before. She ran her fingers over the rough fabric, remembering every scrubbed floor and polished spoon, every stolen moment of connection built beneath the weight of a name that was never truly her own, yet had somehow led her to exactly where her heart was always meant to belong. She folded the dress carefully into a small chest, a private keepsake she intended to treasure for the rest of her life, a reminder that sometimes the truest beginnings arrive disguised as the humblest of circumstances, and that love, when genuine, finds its way through even the most tangled and unlikely of deceptions. A soft knock sounded at her door, and Eleanor opened it to find Julian standing in the corridor, his formal coat abandoned somewhere during the evening's celebrations, his expression relaxed and open in a way she had rarely seen during the weeks of careful distance that once stood between them. I could not sleep without seeing you once more tonight, he admitted, a faint smile touching his features. It seems strange to knock at the door of a room I once assigned you as an unwelcome stranger, only to find myself now hoping desperately that you will let me stay a while longer, simply to talk. Eleanor stepped aside to let him enter, and they sat together near the small window overlooking the kitchen garden where she had first met him again by lantern light weeks earlier, the memory now softened by everything that had happened since. For a long while they spoke quietly of small things, of winter's foal expected any day now, of Charlotte Whitfield's plans to remain at Ashcombe Hall through the wedding preparations, of Lady Ashcombe's evident delight at having orchestrated the entire romance from beginning to end. I owe your grandmother a debt I can never fully repay, Eleanor said softly. Without her kindness and her careful judgment, I do not know how this story would have ended. She has always possessed a gift for seeing the truth in people long before anyone else notices it, Julian said, his gaze warm as it settled on Eleanor's face. I suspect she recognized what was growing between us long before either of us fully understood it ourselves. They spoke, too, of the practical matters that awaited them in the coming weeks, the formal announcement of their engagement to be sent throughout the county, the arrangements Julian intended to make regarding the Whitfield debts, insisting gently but firmly that Eleanor's mother would never again know the fear of losing her home. Charlotte Whitfield had wept with gratitude when he explained his intentions earlier that evening, and Eleanor found herself moved beyond words at the genuine care he showed toward her family, care that had nothing to do with duty or old promises and everything to do with the man he had chosen to become. I want you to know, Julian said eventually, his voice growing more serious as he took her hand gently in his own, that even setting aside my father's promise entirely, even if no old debt had ever bound our families together, I believe I would have found my way to loving you regardless. Something in you called to something in me from that very first rainy night, long before either of us understood what history connected our names. I believe I felt something similar, Eleanor admitted, though I spent so many weeks convincing myself it was merely gratitude, or relief, or simple loneliness finding comfort in unexpected kindness. It was only when Pembroke threatened to tear everything apart that I understood how deeply my feelings for you had grown, how impossible it would be to walk away from Ashcombe Hall without carrying a piece of my heart left behind within these walls. Julian raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles, the same hands that had scrubbed floors and polished silver and mended countless garments during her weeks of quiet disguise. Those hands built something remarkable during your time here, Eleanor, whether you intended it or not. They earned the respect and trust of every servant in this household, They mended far more than fabric within these walls, and they will soon wear the ring that makes you mistress of everything you once served. Eleanor smiled through fresh tears, overwhelmed by the swift and remarkable turn her circumstances had taken since that desperate carriage ride weeks earlier. Whatever comes next, Julian, I hope we build it together honestly, without secrets or hidden names standing between us ever again. Together, and honestly, always, he agreed, drawing her gently into his arms as the candle burned low beside them, the quiet garden below settling into peaceful darkness outside the window. Whatever challenges still awaited them in the months ahead, the fragile trust rebuilt between the Whitfield and Ashcombe families, the wedding preparations soon to consume the entire household, the ongoing work of restoring Ashcombe Hall's fortunes fully, Eleanor understood now that she would face each one not as a servant hiding her true name, but as a woman fully known and fully loved, exactly as she was. A messenger arrived at Ashcombe Hall 3 weeks after the engagement was announced, breathless from a hard ride, carrying news that threatened to unravel the fragile peace the household had only just begun to enjoy. Eleanor was in the garden with her mother, discussing wedding flowers with the same enthusiasm Charlotte Whitfield had once reserved for happier days long before her husband's death, when Mrs. Whitmore came hurrying across the lawn with an unusually anxious expression on her normally composed face. "Lord Ashcombe requests your presence immediately, Miss Whitfield," the housekeeper said, wringing her hands slightly. "There has been word from London. It concerns Lord Pembroke." Eleanor's stomach tightened with old familiar dread as she followed Mrs. Whitmore into the house, her mother close behind her, both women exchanging worried glances as they made their way to Julian's study. They found him standing at his desk, a letter clutched in his hand, his expression grim as he looked up at their arrival. "My cousin has not accepted his defeat gracefully," Julian said without preamble, handing the letter to Eleanor to read for herself. "He has filed a formal challenge against the terms of my father's will, claiming that my judgment has been compromised by what he calls an unsuitable attachment, and arguing that the estate would be better managed under his own guardianship until such questions of judgment can be properly resolved." Eleanor scanned the letter with growing alarm, the legal language cold and calculated, clearly crafted by solicitors experienced in exploiting exactly this kind of family dispute. Can he truly succeed in such a challenge? "I do not believe so," Julian said, though worry still creased his features. "But such matters can drag through the courts for months, perhaps longer, and the uncertainty alone could damage the estate's standing, with creditors and tenants far more than any scandal Pembroke might have engineered at dinner. I have already sent word to my own solicitor, and I intend to travel to London myself within the week to address this challenge directly." "Then I will travel with you," Eleanor said immediately, her voice firm despite the anxiety churning within her. Julian's expression softened, though he shook his head gently. "I would welcome your presence more than you know, but propriety demands we wait until after the wedding for such travels together. I will not give my cousin any further ammunition to question either of our judgments, not when the stakes have grown this serious." Lady Ashcombe, who had entered the study during this exchange, tapped her cane firmly against the floor to draw everyone's attention. "Nonsense," she declared. "I will accompany you to London myself, Julian, as will Eleanor and her mother, properly chaperoned and entirely within the bounds of respectability. Gerald Pembroke will find no scandal to exploit when the entire family presents itself united and unashamed before whatever solicitors and judges he intends to summon." And so, within days, the household found itself preparing for an unexpected journey to London. Trunks packed hastily, arrangements made for the estate's management during their absence, and a tense uncertainty settling over everyone as they contemplated the legal battle awaiting them in the city. The journey itself passed with less difficulty than Eleanor had feared, the dowager's sharp commentary on passing scenery and Julian's occasional wry observations easing the tension that might otherwise have consumed the long hours of travel. Charlotte Whitfield, who had not visited London in many years, found herself both anxious and quietly delighted by the prospect, though she kept her attention firmly fixed on her daughter's well-being throughout the journey. London proved considerably more overwhelming than Eleanor had anticipated, the crowded streets and towering buildings a stark contrast to the quiet countryside surrounding Ashcombe Hall. They took rooms at a townhouse belonging to a distant relation of Lady Ashcombe, and within a day of their arrival, Julian was consumed entirely by meetings with solicitors, reviewing documents and preparing testimony for the hearing that awaited them. Eleanor found herself largely excluded from these proceedings, a fact that frustrated her considerably, given how directly Pembroke's challenge concerned her own presence in Julian's life. She raised the matter one evening as they shared a rare, quiet moment together in the townhouse's small drawing room. I understand your desire to protect me from the harshest aspects of this legal battle, Eleanor said, but I cannot simply wait idle while my own circumstances are debated by strangers in a courtroom I am not permitted to enter. There must be some way I can help. Julian considered this for a long moment, weariness evident in the lines around his eyes after days of exhausting preparation. Perhaps you are right, he admitted finally. My solicitor believes the strongest defense against Pembroke's claims lies not in disputing the legal technicalities of my father's will, but in demonstrating clearly that our engagement stems from genuine character and connection, rather than any impropriety he hopes to suggest. Your own testimony, and your mother's, might carry considerable weight in that regard, if you are both willing to speak before the court. Eleanor did not hesitate. I am entirely willing. The hearing itself, when it finally arrived, proved a tense and formal affair. Pembroke seated across the crowded courtroom with his own solicitor beside him, his expression carrying none of the confident malice Eleanor remembered from that fateful dinner weeks earlier, replaced instead by something closer to grim determination. When Eleanor was called to testify, she rose with steady resolve, remembering the courage that had carried her through weeks of disguise and the humiliation of that public dinner confrontation, drawing on that same strength now before an audience of solicitors and judges rather than country neighbors. She spoke plainly of her family's history with the Ashcombs, of the desperate circumstances that had brought her to Ashcombe Hall, and of the genuine character Julian had shown throughout their acquaintance, both before and after her true identity became known to him. She spoke, too, of Lady Ashcombe's role in the matter, of the dowager's careful judgment and long friendship with her own mother, painting a picture entirely different from the scandal Pembroke had hoped to suggest. The judge, an older man with sharp eyes not unlike Lady Ashcombe's own, listened carefully throughout the proceedings, and when Pembroke's own testimony revealed inconsistencies and evident bitterness rather than genuine concern for the estate's welfare, the outcome began to feel increasingly certain. After 2 long days of hearings, the judge ruled decisively in Julian's favor, dismissing Pembroke's challenge entirely and issuing a stern warning against any further attempts to contest the will without substantially stronger grounds than personal ambition and thinly veiled jealousy. The relief that flooded through the small party as they left the courthouse felt almost overwhelming after weeks of accumulated tension, Julian's shoulders visibly relaxing for the first time since Pembroke's letter had first arrived at Ashcombe Hall. He turned to Eleanor immediately, taking her hands in his own with evident gratitude. Your testimony made all the difference, he said. I do not believe the judge would have ruled so decisively without hearing directly from you about the character of our connection, rather than relying solely on my own solicitor's arguments. We faced it together, Eleanor said simply, as we intend to face everything from now forward. They remained in London only a few days longer, tending to final legal matters and allowing Charlotte Whitfield the rare pleasure of visiting old friends she had not seen since her own fortunes had changed years earlier. Lady Ashcombe, meanwhile, took considerable satisfaction in ensuring that word of Pembroke's failed challenge spread quickly through the appropriate social circles, effectively ending whatever remaining influence he had hoped to wield among their extended family and acquaintances. The journey home to Ashcombe Hall felt entirely different from their anxious departure weeks earlier, the carriage filled with easy conversation and genuine laughter rather than tense uncertainty. As the familiar gates of the estate finally came into view, Eleanor felt a deep and settled sense of belonging she had not expected to feel so completely, not merely toward the grand house itself, but toward the family she was soon to formally join. The wedding, when it finally arrived on a bright autumn morning weeks later, brought together everyone who had played a part in Eleanor's remarkable journey, from the servants who had once worked alongside her without knowing her true name, to the neighboring families who had witnessed Pembroke's failed scheme unravel before their eyes. Alice, now promoted to a position of greater responsibility within the household at Eleanor's personal request, stood among the guests with tears of genuine joy in her eyes, remembering the frightened, exhausted girl who had arrived at Ashcombe Hall soaked and desperate so many months before. Standing before the assembled guests in the small stone chapel on the estate grounds, Eleanor looked at Julian and thought of every step that had led them to this moment: the broken carriage wheel, the misunderstood arrival, the weeks of quiet disguise and growing connection, the dangerous threats and the courage required to face them openly rather than in hiding. Every difficult moment, she realized, had led inevitably to exactly this outcome: a marriage built not on the arrangement her father had once hoped for, nor on the desperate necessity that had first brought her to these gates, but on a genuine and hard-won love that neither scandal nor legal challenge had managed to destroy. As they exchanged their vows beneath the autumn sunlight streaming through the chapel windows, Lady Ashcombe watched from the front pew with quiet satisfaction. Charlotte Whitfield wept openly with joy beside her, and the entire household of Ashcombe Hall celebrated the remarkable conclusion to a story that had begun so many months earlier, with nothing more than a servant's dress and a list of chores mistakenly handed to a desperate young woman who would ultimately become the true and beloved mistress of the very house that had first taken her in as a stranger. After the ceremony, as guests gathered on the sunlit lawn for the wedding breakfast, Julian drew Eleanor aside for a quiet moment away from the celebration, leading her toward the old stable where Winter's foal, now grown sturdy and curious, watched them approach with bright, inquisitive eyes. "I wanted one private moment before the celebrations claimed the rest of our day," he said, taking both her hands in his own. "This is where I first began to see you clearly, Eleanor, sheltered from the storm and speaking with more honesty than I realized at the time. It seemed fitting to return here today, now that every storm between us has finally passed." Eleanor smiled, resting her head briefly against his shoulder as the foal nuzzled curiously at her wedding gown. "I never imagined, that rainy night when my carriage wheel broke outside your gates, that I would find not only my family's rescue, but a home, and a love I had never dared to hope for." "Nor did I imagine," Julian replied, "that the servant girl I so carelessly handed a chore list to on our very first meeting would one day stand beside me as my wife, having taught me more about honesty, courage, and genuine devotion than any lesson duty alone could ever have provided." They returned to the celebration hand in hand, the golden afternoon light settling warmly over Ashcombe Hall and its assembled guests. The old gray servant's dress folded safely away in Eleanor's private keepsake chest, a quiet reminder of humble beginnings that had ultimately led to the truest happiness either of them had ever known.